Hello and welcome to the Healthy Food, Healthy Farms webinar series. Today's webinar is Arsenic, Organic Formula, and the Food System. I'm David Wallinga with Healthy Food Action and the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, or IATP. Healthy Food Action is a nationwide effort to engage health professionals around the food and agriculture policy issues critical to creating a healthier food system. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, or CHE. After presentations from the three panelists today, we will take your questions. Please submit questions anytime during the webinar, the earlier the better, using the right-hand menu on your screen. Look for the box labeled Enter Question for Staff. Type your question there and then hit Send. We'll cover as many questions as possible in the 20 minutes or so at the end of the hour. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Brian Jackson from Dartmouth College and Dr. Keeve Nachman from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and I will be your third presenter. Dr. Jackson is a research associate professor and director of the Trace Metal Analysis Core Facility at Dartmouth College. He specializes in environmental analytical chemistry, especially of arsenic and mercury. Keeve Nachman is an assistant scientist with the Johns Hopkins Department of Environmental Health Sciences. Prior to joining the Johns Hopkins faculty, Dr. Nachman completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the EPA and worked as a toxicologist and risk assessor for the Army Corps of Engineers. In addition to his academic role, he directs the Farming for the Future program at the Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, where he investigates a variety of issues related to the industrial model of food production. Myself, I'm a physician and senior advisor in science, food, and health at IATP in Minneapolis. Since our landmark report from 2006 called Playing Chicken, IATP has put a spotlight on arsenic in the food system. We advocate for food produced in ways that reduce exposure to pollutants like arsenic, as well as for models of sustainable agriculture that support this kind of healthier food. Today's presentation focuses on arsenic, which is one of the contaminants in the food supply and in the broader environment that we actually know the most about. Inorganic arsenic is the more researched of the forms of arsenic, and it's been most prominently associated with cancer at various sites, including lung, bladder, and skin cancer, as well as other sites. There are other non-cancer effects related to arsenic exposure as well, including those listed. And in addition, I would note some more recent research linking arsenic exposure to hormone-disrupting effects. There are not only these chronic health effects, but also acute effects. So in short, arsenic is truly an environmental contaminant or pollutant linked to a variety of cancer and non-cancer effects. I now hand things over to Dr. Brian Jackson, who will start things off with describing some of his intriguing recent research published on arsenic and brown rice syrup. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. Right, so I'm just going to take 10 minutes to describe our recent paper, on arsenic, organic foods, and brown rice syrup. I'd like to take a couple of minutes just to look at the broader picture. We focused on brown rice syrup for reasons that you will see as we go through this presentation, but really the broader issue is arsenic in rice. And let me first say that we fully acknowledge that arsenic is that rice is a staple food for many of the world's population. It's an essential agronomic resource for the world. However, it does contain more arsenic than other grains. In 1998, a study identified rice as a major food source of inorganic arsenic to the diet. And since then, there's been an increasing awareness and a larger database on the levels and type of arsenic in rice. And in general, when drinking water exposure to arsenic is low, then food is the main source of dietary exposure. Comparing food and water, for water we have good epidemiological data on risk, and we have a general consensus on a drinking water limit of 10 ppb. So the World Health Organization, the EU, and the US EPA agree at 10 ppb. There are no consensus regulations for food. So I'd just like to look at a couple of different food regulations or documents that relate to arsenic regulations in food. This codex is a publication from the World Health Organization. It's available online. You can see the URL there, and it's available free for download. It's a good summary of existing worldwide guidelines and standards. A couple of points I'd like to point out from this publication are that the permissible tolerable daily maximum intake level for arsenic was set at 2.1 back in 1983, so that's 2.1 micrograms of inorganic arsenic per kilogram of your body weight per day. That was withdrawn by this organization because, although this is not explicitly stated in the document, it's too close to limits where there is an observable adverse effect, which suggests that any future level is going to be lower than that 2.1. This codex document then goes on to suggest a number of future potential maximum limits for arsenic in rice and rice products. And one of the limits they suggest is 0.2 ppm or 200 ppb for inorganic arsenic in infant food. Now I'm suggesting that this is too high. If you do the calculations and you play devil's advocate and say, okay, we have an infant formula that's 200 ppb, that would then relate to a formula that the child would drink that is 30 ppb inorganic arsenic. And again, if you do play devil's advocate and assume it's 200 ppb inorganic arsenic in the infant formula, calculate what the daily exposure rate to inorganic arsenic is for a 6 kilogram baby. That's 3.5 micrograms of arsenic per kilogram body weight per day, or for a 9 kilogram baby, 2.3 micrograms of arsenic per kilogram body weight per day. I'm making some assumptions about how much formula the child would drink, but both those numbers are higher than the 2.1 value that this organization has withdrawn because, again, implicitly they say it's too high. Another good document is EFSA, European Food Safety Authority, formed a scientific panel and produced this scientific opinion on arsenic in food. One of the co-authors of our study was a panelist on this. They looked at 100,000 data values for arsenic in food, most of them total because there is a paucity of inorganic arsenic data. And they state that the exposure range where there's a 1% excess risk is somewhere between 0.3 and 8 micrograms inorganic arsenic per kilogram body weight per day. This is not going to be their recommendation for a maximum daily intake level. Presumably that's going to be much lower. They're trying to find out where there's this 1% level of risk. They have an interesting statistic that where they looked at food frequency questionnaires, and they say for the general European diet, the average exposure is anywhere from 0.1 microgram arsenic, inorganic arsenic per kilogram body weight per day to about 0.5. And the highest 5% of that population, it's anywhere from 0.4 to 1 microgram inorganic arsenic per kilogram per day. There's another limit we can look at, or recommendation we can look at that came to my attention after the paper. This is EPA IRIS. They have an oral reference dose where they've set the daily exposure range for a lifetime exposure where they think, based on the current science, there's no appreciable risk. They've set that limit, the ORD, at 0.3 micrograms per arsenic per kilogram body weight per day. These are not enforceable limits, but they're out there in the database that you can look at. And they say there's a lot of uncertainty associated with this number, so the range, they say, is anywhere from 0.1 to 0.8 micrograms inorganic arsenic. California has a Prop 65, and they're looking to restrain risks of cancer to less than 1 in 100,000. And they say that for inorganic arsenic, there's no significant risk if your daily intake is less than 10 micrograms inorganic arsenic. And they make no proviso for body weight. Okay, before I move to our study, let me just point out the differences between inorganic and organic arsenic. Inorganic arsenic is naturally occurring, but found in geological formations, in rocks, in soil, and in groundwater. It is the most toxic form. It's the non-threshold carcinogen according to the National Research Council. As I said before, there's lots of good epidemiological data linking exposure through drinking water to increase incidences of disease. For water, we can pretty much make the assumption that a total arsenic number is equivalent to inorganic arsenic number. For food, you can't make that assumption. For organic arsenic, in the case of rice, it's pretty much dimethyl arsenate is the main organic form of arsenic, DMA. That's formed naturally in soil by bacteria. It's a human metabolite of exposure to inorganic arsenic, so our bodies can take inorganic arsenic, they can methylate it, and we urinate out these methylated forms like DMA. It's also a man-made and has been used as a pesticide or herbicide, although it was discontinued from use by the EPA in 2009. In the recent story and information about arsenic in apple juice, the FDA declared that DMA, or these organic forms, are essentially harmless. I think that's overstating what the science says right now. They're certainly less toxic than inorganic arsenic, but I don't think we have enough data to say they're essentially harmless. So having said that, let me go to the study now. We started out actually just basically not looking at brown rice syrup per se. We were looking at arsenic exposure to infants. And so we started out looking at a number of different baby formulas, trying to quantify what the amount of inorganic arsenic, and this is total arsenic actually, in these formulas. And this number here relates to the concentration in the powder itself, not in the formula a child would drink. Our initial hypothesis was that using a rice starch as an additive would increase arsenic in the formula, and we found this not to be the case. There's no difference between formulas, infant formulas that have rice starch and infant formulas that do not. And you can see the range is relatively low, and these are in good agreement with an FDA study from 2004 and a recent study from Sweden last year. So continuing this study, I went down to our local co-op, grabbed 2 more formulas, and you can see an order of 20 times higher at least than any of the other infant formulas we tested. These are the 2 toddler formulas that use organic brown rice syrup as the main ingredient. So until we got this pretty startling result, looked at the ingredients in this formula, our study was not focused on organic brown rice syrup at all. But we know enough about arsenic and rice, so as soon as we saw that ingredient in these results, we suspected that the arsenic was coming from the brown rice syrup. We then went ahead and not just, we had previously quantified total arsenic in these formulas. Now we want to look at how much is inorganic, which is the most toxic form, and how much is organic. So we did that analysis. You can see for the dairy products, we've tested 2 different batches, and they're pretty much identical. For inorganic arsenic, I'm comparing here to the EPA, WHO Safe Drinking Water limit. The dairy is just below in inorganic and approaching 3 times as high in total arsenic. We tested 2 different soy lots that look very different from each other. One has really high total arsenic but lower inorganic arsenic, and one higher inorganic but lower total. Now, making this assumption again and calculating the micrograms of inorganic arsenic exposure per kilogram per day for a 6 kilogram infant drinking 6 4 fluid ounce bottles. You can see here, this is just inorganic arsenic now, not total. So the dairy, the soy A and soy B, a lot higher than this EPA reference dose. And these are the error bars on triplicate measurements in these formulas, and this actually is the lower limit 0.1 up to 0.8 and the mean 0.3 reference dose. So you can see for both scenarios, a 6 kilogram infant, a 9 kilogram toddler drinking the same amount of formula, then these levels are higher than the EPA reference dose. Fully would like to bring your attention to the fact that EPAs, they're based on lifetime exposure. They might not be directly applicable to short-term exposure. The interpretation of our data is really complicated because we don't have any good guidelines for this type of scenario. So then we looked at some brown rice syrups. We obtained 3 from the web, and 2 were the same basic syrup from different lots. And all I'd like to say here is that these results aren't that surprising. The syrups range from about 80 ppb up to 300 ppb in total arsenic. These are quite similar to the ranges of arsenic you would see in rice. People have suggested to me that maybe there's a concentration factor in producing syrup from rice that leads to higher arsenic numbers. The data would suggest that's not the case. That definitive study has not been done, but this range is of arsenic in the syrups is quite in line with what we know to be arsenic in rice. So we then looked at arsenic in some cereal bars which may or may not contain rice products and organic brown rice syrup. And here you can see we tested 29. So 7 of these bars had no rice ingredients, 4 had rice but no organic brown rice syrup, 5 organic brown rice syrup but no rice, and 13 had brown rice syrup and rice. And basically, the no rice had the lowest arsenic. If you have a rice ingredient, the arsenic level increases. If you have a rice ingredient that's brown rice syrup but not rice grain or rice flour, then the levels of arsenic are about the same, which supports this idea that brown rice syrup is just another rice ingredient that has arsenic associated with it. And then if you have 2 or more ingredients, brown rice syrup and rice grain or rice flour, then you have higher average concentrations. You can see there's a big variability in what the lowest bar arsenic concentration was and the highest bar. This is sort of understandable. We don't know how much of each of these individual ingredients goes into making one of these bars. There was a lot of misinterpretation in the media about this data set. What I've done here is taken the 13 highest cereal and energy bars and plotted them for their inorganic arsenic content. And then taking the EPA reference dose and of 0.3 and multiplying that by 25 for a child or 60 for kilograms for an adult, equated what the no adverse effect limit for total inorganic arsenic content per day would be. And you can see that all of these, even the highest 13 bars, remember there are 16 that will be lower on the scale on this, they do not approach these reference doses where you don't get appreciable risk. Like I say, this was misinterpreted in the media after the study came out. So just sort of summarizing in the response to the paper, I think everyone was taken aback by just how it was focused on in the media. The press releases were issued by the US FDA, the US Rice Federation, the Organic Trade Association, among others, and many, many media reports. What I think the way forward are, and some manufacturers have suggested this is the way forward too, is to take what we know about arsenic in rice, and we really know a lot right now, and to source rice that is low in arsenic, especially for products aimed at-risk populations. And they would be infants or people on a rice subsistence diet, gluten-free diets. In the long term, farmers could change cultivars or agronomic practices to produce rice that's lower in arsenic. But I think clearly we need some product testing, some guidelines, and some regulations concerning this particular issue. And if you look at these various world regulatory bodies and the US FDA, it seems that this may well be coming down the line. So that's sort of a brief synopsis of the paper, and now I'd like to hand it over to Keeve Nachman, who will continue the discussion on arsenic in food.
Okay, can you hear me? I'd like to say thanks to David Wallinga and the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy for having me here on the call today, and of course, thanks also to Brian Jackson for his presentation. I'm going to be talking today about arsenical drugs in food animal production, which is a topic I've been working on for quite some time. But before I jump into this case study, I just wanted to review some of the literature on inorganic arsenic-related health effects. I know Dave touched on these before, but I thought we'd revisit them quickly. Arsenic via epidemiologic studies conducted in Taiwan and Chile is a very well characterized human carcinogen. The strongest evidence is for cancers of the lung, bladder, and skin, but there's additional evidence pointing towards cancers of the prostate, liver, and kidney. Arsenic at very, very high doses, far beyond what we'll be talking about today, has actually been demonstrated to be a transplacental carcinogen as well. There's an ever-expanding body of literature linking chronic low-level exposures to inorganic arsenic to a wide spectrum of non-cancer health effects ranging from cardiovascular disease, diabetes mellitus, neurological deficits in the developing brain, adverse pregnancy outcomes, and a number of other effects. And again, at very high doses, arsenic can elicit acute toxicities, irritating the gastrointestinal tract and causing edema. I wanted to go to the EPA IRIS database for a moment. In February of 2010, the agency released a draft update to its cancer assessment of inorganic arsenic and concluded that it now believes inorganic arsenic to be 17 times more potent of a carcinogen than it previously assumed. And what that means is that regulatory limits that were set previously using the old cancer potency factor may underestimate cancer risks to the population. And one other point to mention is that for the first time, the IRIS program had split its assessments of arsenic's cancer-causing ability and its ability to elicit non-cancer health effects. And we are still waiting for the release of the draft document that documents its potency in inducing non-cancer health effects. But we believe that the oral reference dose that Brian mentioned that currently is still on the books will be updated and reflected downward as well. So anyways, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's switch to the case study at hand. So I'm going to be talking about arsenical drugs used in food animal production. The most common of those drugs is a drug called roxarsone that until 2011 was estimated to be used in about 88% of broiler chickens. It's also approved for use in turkey feed and swine feed, and it was first approved in 1944. The reasons for which it is used are growth promotion, enhancements in pigmentation of meat to combat intestinal parasites, and to treat dysentery in swine. The literature base that actually supports its effectiveness for any of these purposes is fairly shaky and mostly consists of studies conducted before 1950. Again, I mentioned we know that broiler chickens until 2011 were 88% of them were fed roxarsone. Things are a little more unclear now, and I'll get to why that is in a moment. We've never been able to get solid numbers on the frequency of its use among swine and turkeys, so unfortunately I have nothing to report there. There is currently a single domestic producer of roxarsone. It's a company called Alpharma that was just recently acquired by the Pfizer pharmaceutical company. I wanted to give you a little bit of background and historical context on roxarsone. As I mentioned, it was first approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1944, and a few years later, the FDA set tolerance levels for arsenic residues in meat products at 2 parts per million in liver and 0.5 part per million in uncooked meat. These tolerances are still on the books and have not yet been updated since 1951, despite an expansive body of epidemiologic literature linking arsenic exposure at very low levels to health effects. In 1981, an environmental impact analysis was conducted for FDA by a consulting firm to evaluate the potential for human and ecological exposures to arsenic as a result of arsenical food animal drugs. And that impact analysis made a conclusion that there were no environmental concerns related to the use of roxarsone, but questioned whether or not there may be some dietary exposures that are of interest. However, 2 years later, the National Research Council actually developed the approach to environmental chemical risk assessment, which calls into question the rigor and quality of the environmental impact assessment that was conducted prior to that. This is a figure from a paper that we published a couple of years ago looking at the various ways by which humans can come into contact with arsenic as a result of the use of roxarsone and other arsenical drugs, and I'm going to sort of frame the rest of my discussion around these. But there are 2 primary classes of exposures. One would be exposures through the diet, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, and also exposures through the environment when poultry waste is managed. So first, let's talk about arsenic in poultry products. There is literature, a certain number of studies documenting that some of the arsenic administered to birds stays behind in the poultry tissue. Much of the literature has actually shown that the majority of the arsenic ends up in poultry waste. But anyways, there are 4 studies of broiler chickens, and I know David mentioned one of these before because he's the lead author on it. That would be the 2006 Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy paper. And each of these studies adds a critical piece of information to the total puzzle. But unfortunately, if we're interested in estimating what human risks may be for cancer in relation to eating poultry products, we can't do it because we're missing information about arsenic species that are present in chicken muscle tissue, which is the most commonly consumed cut of the bird. Pork and turkey products, which also, if are raised using roxarsone or other arsenicals, may accumulate arsenic as well, but those products have not been studied in the peer-reviewed literature. I wanted to highlight the last of the 4 studies that were mentioned on the previous slide. This was a study that was actually conducted by FDA, and just a side note, it's fairly rare for FDA to actually conduct its own study to evaluate the safety, especially for a drug that it's already approved. So it was kind of unique that the study even happened. So what FDA did was they took about 102 birds and split them in half and administered roxarsone to half of them and used the other half as controls. And then they looked at the total arsenic levels in the muscle tissue and in liver tissues, and they decided that they would speciate the arsenic that was present in the liver tissues. They cited methodological difficulties that did not allow them to speciate the arsenic in muscle tissues. But what they found was that in both mussels and livers, the birds that were treated with roxarsone at 2 different withdrawal periods accumulated arsenic far more than those that were not administered roxarsone. And for the livers where arsenic was speciated, there was an increase in inorganic arsenic concentrations in the treated birds' livers as compared to the untreated birds. Again, it was too bad that they weren't able to speciate the arsenic in muscle tissue, and that really puts a damper on any effort to quantitatively estimate the cancer risk associated with consuming chicken products. With livers, we can move towards that, but the challenge is that there are not good data about frequency of consumption of liver tissue, of chicken livers in the U.S. population. Okay, so let's shift gears for a moment and talk about poultry waste. I mentioned before that the current belief is that the majority of the roxarsone that's administered to food animals actually ends up in animal waste. And a fact sheet from the drug manufacturer Alpharma estimates that each broiler excretes about 150 milligrams of roxarsone over its 42-day lifespan. So if you do a little bit of simple math, you'll learn that if you use 2008 broiler production numbers, which are about 9 billion broilers per year, and that number stayed pretty constant over time, and you multiply it by the amount of arsenic that's present in the waste from a single broiler, you can estimate that about 340 metric tons of arsenic is introduced into the environment every year as a result of poultry production. And given that poultry house waste that's land applied often includes everything in the house, so that's not just the waste itself, but that's also the spilled feed, we may actually underestimate the environmental deposition of arsenic each year if we only consider the waste. So this really contributes to environmental burdens of arsenic. So what happens to the waste, and why does it matter that we're dumping arsenic into the environment? Well, much of poultry waste, I'd say the majority of it, is actually land applied. And what happens there is that certain weather events are able to mobilize arsenic both horizontally through runoff and potentially vertically through leaching into groundwater sources into bodies of water where people may actually come into contact with that arsenic. And one point that I'd like to make is that there's an extensive body of literature that actually shows that while roxarsone and arsenical drugs are fed to poultry in an organic form, there are biotic processes and photolytic processes that convert arsenic in poultry waste very rapidly into the more toxic inorganic forms that Dr. Jackson described before. So anyways, we land apply most of the poultry. In some cases, especially when we're talking about liquid manures like swine waste, we store them in these large storage lagoons that I've just displayed, and certain weather events, more extreme weather events, can actually cause these lagoons to rupture and leak contents into the surrounding environment where people may come into contact with them, and that is a concern that extends far beyond arsenic for other contaminants that are present in animal waste. Recently, especially on Maryland's eastern shore in the Delmarva Peninsula, where we do a lot of our work, there's been concern over nutrient overloading into the Chesapeake Bay. And to remedy some of those concerns, the industry has moved towards other management strategies for poultry waste that may also create different opportunities for people to come into contact with arsenic. The first of those strategies is the construction of poultry waste to energy incinerators, which have 2 waste streams or outputs. The first, when poultry waste is incinerated, there's an ash product that's produced that we have yet to evaluate, but some of the arsenic may actually concentrate in the ash that, as you may have guessed, is then used as fertilizer. The other waste stream from a poultry waste incinerator, as you might guess, is the air stream. And arsenic is an element, and burning it or incinerating it does nothing to eliminate it. So it has to go somewhere. It's either in the ash or it's in the waste stream of the stack. Another alternative use for managing poultry waste is to pelletize it, and I actually did some of my doctoral thesis work examining pelletized poultry waste as a source of arsenic exposure, and we found, as we would have expected, that these pellets actually concentrate arsenic as well. And the difference here between pelletized poultry waste and land application of poultry waste in agricultural settings is that this kind of product is sold in your hardware and garden stores. I actually went out to my local Lowe's and Home Depot and bought a couple of bags of it for my study, and what that means is you're shifting the exposures not just to rural agricultural areas, but also to people who are able to buy residential fertilizer as well. So you're expanding the exposed population by pelletizing the waste. And lastly, poultry waste is routinely fed to cattle and back to poultry. And I have yet to see any literature examining potential arsenic residues in milk or in beef. So anyways, the use of arsenic leads to a number of environmental pathways by which humans may come into contact once again with arsenic. So getting back to roxarsone itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about the political story of 2011 and beyond. So the morning of June 8th, I was notified by a colleague that FDA had just released a press announcement that it was going to have a teleconference to announce something big. And it turned out that FDA at that point decided to announce its study, and they had before that gone and spoken with representatives of Pfizer, and they ended up having a joint press conference to announce that Pfizer had plans to suspend sale of roxarsone. Now, it's important to understand the nuances here, and that suspension of sale or suspension of marketing does not mean that they have withdrawn the approval of the drug, nor does it mean that FDA has banned the drug. So the drug is still perfectly legal, and Pfizer has the opportunity at any point to return it to the market. They also announced at that point that they'd continue selling roxarsone until a month after that announcement to give producers time to transition away from using the drug. And we've heard anecdotal evidence of producers actually stockpiling roxarsone during that month-long period, but it's very challenging for us to validate those anecdotes. In August of 2011, a number of poultry industry trade groups, the National Chicken Council and the U.S. Egg and Poultry Association, sent a very strongly worded letter to Margaret Hamburg of the FDA criticizing the agency for conducting a study to evaluate the safety of roxarsone, noting that they felt that it was limited in scale, it was not peer-reviewed, and that the feed formulation used in the study was atypical of what you'd expect to find in real poultry feed. So they felt that the conclusions were inappropriate and felt that FDA had acted incorrectly in putting pressure on Pfizer to suspend sale of the drug. And interestingly enough, and this sort of speaks to whether or not Pfizer may actually end up returning the drug to the market, Pfizer was hit by a lawsuit from the Wallinga chemical company, who it turns out was actually manufacturing the drug for Pfizer, and they were sued for $20 million over the loss of market in North America, both in the U.S. and in Canada. So that's just a little interesting background. So currently the drug appears to still be unavailable from Pfizer, although I have my Google alert set up to let me know anytime roxarsone appears on the internet, and almost daily I'll get a notification that there are international companies very willing to sell me roxarsone. So the drug has not entirely gone away. So let's talk about how to deal with the problem. As I mentioned before, the use of roxarsone creates a number of environmental and dietary public health issues that extend beyond the jurisdiction of any one federal agency. Now, FDA is responsible for the permission to use the drug in food animal production, though once the drug is used in food animals, it ends up contaminating foods and environmental media that are under the jurisdiction of the FDA, the EPA, and the USDA. So, and theoretically OSHA as well, as workers who work in poultry houses may actually come into contact with some of the dust from the feed in the houses. The existing regulatory mechanisms that exist that one would hope would address some of these potential exposures are very frequently inadequate. An example of this is that animal waste standards include nothing that would address arsenic content of animal waste. Comparably, the standards for biosolids actually have a standard for arsenic, though those standards have been criticized as being not necessarily stringent enough. I think the allowable concentration of arsenic in biosolids is about 40 parts per million. And based on meetings that we've held with the Center for Veterinary Medicine at FDA, it does not appear that there are any further plans for the agency to act on roxarsone or to evaluate the safety of any of the other arsenical drugs that are approved for use in food animal production. One side note, an alternative drug called nitrazone, which was commonly used in turkey, we've heard through proceedings of the Maryland General Assembly that that has taken the place of roxarsone in the turkey industry. So if things aren't going to work on the regulatory side, perhaps some legislative interventions may be more appropriate. And I've had the good fortune to be involved in a number of legislative initiatives aimed at eliminating the use of arsenical drugs in poultry production, and unfortunately none of them have been very successful. Congressman Steve Israel of New York has, for 2 congressional sessions, introduced bills that would ban roxarsone, and neither have really caught steam yet, unfortunately. In the state of Maryland, I think there's been a stronger initiative to move towards banning arsenical drugs in food animal production. The first 2 years the bills were introduced, we really didn't see a lot of motion, but this year things tended to look very promising, and actually just this week the House and the Maryland General Assembly passed a bill that would ban roxurson, but unfortunately, at the 11th hour and 59th minute, the bill was amended and actually entirely gutted to the point where it is completely meaningless, which has been challenging. So we're waiting to see what happens in the Senate. Hopefully the Senate will not pass the bill so we can try again next year. But anyways, in sum, the use of arsenical drugs in poultry production leads to some unnecessary human exposures to inorganic arsenic. While those exposures are not nearly as high as those described by some of the food products that Dr. Jackson examined in his study, roxurson and other arsenical drugs are an example of a deliberate addition of arsenic into the food system, and one that we could take some very simple steps to eliminate altogether. So I think there's sort of a clear rationale for moving on this one, since we know that any exposure to arsenic may, inorganic arsenic may increase the risk of cancer in an exposed person. So thanks very much for your time and attention.
All right. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about some of the policy issues that have been raised by the two previous speakers. And we heard from Dr. Nachman about roxurson added to animal feed, and we heard from Dr. Jackson about rice syrup used as a sweetener in various products. And we know that these can lead to human exposure to arsenic through a variety of different pathways, whether it's ingestion of food products or water, or inhalation of arsenic and dust, or through incinerator emissions, as Keeve mentioned. But there's a whole slew of other uses of arsenic and also arsenic contamination problems that add to this exposure. So for example, we know inorganic arsenic is a contaminant, naturally occurring contaminant in many water systems and soil, and this can lead, for example, to arsenic in apple juice, and that was an issue that came up last fall, which adds to the exposure from these other sources. Arsenic, too, was intentionally used for decades as a pesticide on cotton and other crops, and this included both lead arsenate as well as organic arsenicals. And one might think that these would have been phased out long ago, but in fact, the organic arsenic pesticides are either just phased out in 2009 or are still being used in some cases on cotton. So then there's a whole slew of other potential policies from a regulation standpoint that have not yet been addressed, really. So these include things like continued use of these organic pesticides on golf courses, in highway rights of way, and on cotton, as I said. The fact that we don't have any allowable levels, legal levels for arsenic in apple juice, for example, or in these rice-based formula products. And then there's other issues like the incineration of arsenic contaminated waste, like from poultry, is not federally regulated. So states are now moving forward to permit these facilities. The land application of animal manure with arsenic back onto food-producing land is largely unregulated. So there's a lot of possibilities for policy decisions that can be informed by the science that we're hearing, but not determined by. They're basically policy or political decisions. And just taking a further step back, I'll make the observation that many of these intentional uses of arsenic in agriculture or food production, whether as a pesticide or as an additive to animal feed, or allowing arsenic-containing food ingredients to be, like rice syrup, to be incorporated into other products. These are things that are typically have been approved without thinking of the human health impacts of the arsenic exposure. And it's only been much, much later, or even decades later, that we've tried to post hoc determine what the risk is of these practices which continue in the interim. And so there's a whole slew of science policy questions that remain on the table. So for example, knowing that already millions of Americans are drinking arsenic-contaminated drinking water up to the legally allowable level of 10 parts per billion, what should we make of intentionally using arsenic compounds for purposes like as an animal feed additive? It was noted by Dr. Jackson that there's very little research or information about organic arsenicals, or much less than inorganic. So in the absence of much research, should we just assume that, as has been done to date, that the organic arsenic exposures and the risks should be mostly ignored by the people assessing these risks from a regulatory standpoint? Who should bear the onus of doing the kind of testing that Dartmouth College has done, or earlier that my institute did? Should it be organizations like ours, or should it be the FDA? I think it's pretty clear from the FDA's response both to apple juice and rice, as well as chicken contamination with arsenic, that there's a lot of room for doing additional testing. I know FDA has issues with its budget being large enough to do that testing. And then finally, there is this split authority with EPA regulating arsenic pesticides, one part of FDA regulating incorporation of arsenic compounds into poultry feed, another part being responsible for things like brown rice syrups. But given the split authority, there isn't really any one entity that's responsible for accumulating the risks across these various food products, water, other uses of arsenic like pesticide use. And then finally, risk assessment policy. It's not clear that the regulations protect or are designed to assess the risks to the most vulnerable people, namely infants or fetuses, or even children that eat a lot of chicken or eat a lot of rice-based products, rather than some hypothetical average person. And so as a result, when you have a regulatory level that's based on an average exposure, it really does mean that the more likelihood that the more highly consuming person or the more highly exposed child is going to have an unsatisfactory level of exposure. And so I would just end on the point that there's a lot of policies. I've talked mostly about federal policies, but there's policies within hospitals and health institutions that could be a response to these issues. So for example, my group put together this fact sheet on arsenic in poultry purchased by hospitals, and made the point that hospitals, if they want, can require the companies that manage their food services and that supply the food to their cafeterias to preferentially source poultry raised without arsenic. And this would be a way to do institutional policy in the absence of federal policy. And so regardless of these policy issues and where they occur, this is the kind of place where the Healthy Food Action Network tries to identify opportunities that folks like you all can weigh in on. IATP, for example, has a petition with the Center for Food Safety from 2006, or excuse me, from 2009 to ban the use of Roxarsone, and then another set of petitions to set a tolerance of 0 for these arsenic residues in meat products. But in the future, we'll be looking for other opportunities around the issues that we've been talking about. So let me just wrap up there and go back to the list of questions that we've received from you all. And I'm going to be directing these to specific panelists. And let me just start off with a question for Dr. Nachman. And it's a pretty simple one. The question is arsenic use allowed in certified organic poultry?
Thanks, David. No, arsenic is not allowed in certified organic poultry. All antibiotics are prohibited from use in certified organic poultry. And yeah.
Okay. And a follow-up question, what controls exist in the use of roxarsone in other countries? And what controls exist to protect against importation of chicken products containing roxarsone?
So the controls in other countries would really be specific to individual countries, so it's challenging to generalize about them. We have heard that arsenic tolerances in the EU are so stringent that European producers of food animals do not use arsenical drugs. In terms of importing, I don't know that we import much chicken. I actually don't have data on that. But assuming we're not importing much, I would think, if you were able to purchase USDA organic, it would be a way to avoid arsenic in meat.
Okay. And keeping in mind that at least some of the audience members are clinicians, there's a series of questions, I think, for Dr. Jackson about, in light of your study findings, what sort of recommendations should we make around consumption of rice milk, both for children and for adults?
Yeah, so bear in mind that I'm actually an environmental analytical chemist, and risk assessment is not my area of expertise, so actually Keeve or yourself, David, feel free to chip in at any time. I mean, really, without any product testing, it's very difficult to say what the arsenic exposure is through rice milk. It's very probably going to be higher than just cow's milk, for example. Let me give you an example from the UK Food Agency has, as a precaution, advised that parents should not give infants and young children rice milk as a substitute for cow's milk, just because of this particular issue, that without any measurement, you really don't know what the arsenic levels are in that particular rice milk.
And Dr. Jackson, is there similar advisory from the FDA, or what's been the response after your studies around that issue?
I'm not aware of any advisories from the FDA on that issue. But
I was interested just in going back and looking at the FDA response for the apple juice, where again the levels found were fairly low compared to other food products, but the FDA website says that it's our position that drinking apple juice is safe. So there wasn't specific advice in terms of, as in the UK, about whether people should try and avoid certain products. And so I just think that's interesting. Dr. Jackson, in terms of, do you know, in terms of children who are on rice or soy-based formula because of lactose intolerance, do we know anything about whether those kids are at greater risk for buildup of arsenic? Is there some connection there with how their body metabolizes arsenic?
you mean they're on rice syrup-based formulas because of intolerance to lactose?
It just says brown rice, soy formulas. Yes, because they're lactose intolerant.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that question, I'm afraid.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Maybe Keeve can.
Sure. You know, there really is not accumulation of arsenic in fat tissue. It tends to accumulate in keratinous tissues like the hair, fingernails, and skin, and the majority of the arsenic is actually eliminated in the urine. So I wouldn't necessarily be concerned about susceptibility in those children. unique or for other children.
Yeah. Just a note here, it sounds like from a clinician saying many of the children that we're seeing, and I think extrapolating from the question, it says children on the autism spectrum are being tested and come back with high arsenic levels, and we're correlating it with conventional chicken consumption. But then they go on to ask a question, do we have any idea if hemp or pea protein contains arsenic as well? Either of the panelists?
I'm sorry, what were the last two products you named?
Hemp and pea-based protein. These are, yeah, so either hemp milk or I guess protein powders that are sold as supplements. I'm not aware of any information on that.
Nor am I.
No,
Yeah.
me neither.
Okay. There are a couple of questions that came in early of Dr. Jackson or Keeve about methods in testing for brown rice sweeteners. And it raises, I don't know much about this, but it raises the issue around interference occurring with sugar-rich food matrices. Do you have any comments on methodologic issues?
Yeah, there are basically, I think, two potential interferences for arsenic in particular. So the state-of-the-art instrument to use for measuring low-level arsenic is ICP-MS. And it measures arsenic based on its mass at 75. So in some matrices, you can get a combination of smaller atoms that come together to have a mass of 75 that the instrument doesn't distinguish from arsenic. So that's one potential interference. That's called the polyatomic interference. There's also a more general interference with these low molecular weight organics such as sugars and alcohols in samples, is that you get the instrument gets an increased sensitivity to arsenic if there's a lot of these sugars being passed into the instrument. Our measurements noted both these potential interferences. So for the polyatomics, we used collision cell ICP-MS. This collision cell was developed to alleviate any of these polyatomic interferences. And to get rid of this potential signal enhancement from low molecular weight sugars, we did a very rigorous acid digestion of these formulas. So high temperatures, high pressures, strong acids to basically decompose these sugars. We then also introduced into the instrument constantly this 5% of butanol to try and level out this sensitivity increase from low molecular weight organic molecules so that it's the same in samples and standards. And finally, we use the method of standard additions to do the calibration on these particular infant formulas. So any sensitivity boost is actually seen by the standards and the sample. And so I think with that combination, there really should be no question about either of those two interferences affecting with our data.
Thanks. Here's a question I'm going to take, actually. Is there any data on arsenic in eggs as opposed to poultry meat? And I know that there was, I think last year, an episode where people raising chickens for egg laying in their backyards were having problems in their children with high arsenic levels, and ultimately it was figured out that they were using feed labeled only for broiler chickens, actually for their backyard egg-laying chickens, and that arsenic in that feed was going into the eggs which their family was eating. So that's the only information I know about, but it was a question of people inadvertently using feed that they weren't supposed to. Here's another set of questions about where the arsenic's coming from in rice products. Dr. Jackson, do you know?
Yeah, well, my take on this is that this is a natural process for the greater extent. Just from a physiological standpoint, rice tends to take up arsenic. The general soil conditions, paddy soil conditions, mean that arsenic is very soluble in the soil. Rice needs silica physiologically. arsenite, which is the form of arsenic in reduced soils and saturated soils, is very similar chemically to silica and gets taken up by rice. That is not to say that in areas where soil has been contaminated by use of arsenical pesticides, if you have more arsenic in the soil, then I can completely agree that you may well get more arsenic in the actual rice plant itself. That, again, in areas where there is no arsenic contamination of soil, you still could get high levels of arsenic in the rice because of just ambient arsenic levels in the soil.
And do we know, is that the same set of issues around the apple juice? Do we know where the arsenic for the apples is coming from? Is it pesticide contamination or Keeve?
With the arsenic in apple juice, there are a couple of possible explanations. So a lot of the apple juice we actually can buy in stores in the States, the concentrate used to make the juice is sourced from other countries. And some of those countries may be places where arsenical pesticides are still permitted for use. And apple groves in the U.S. historically until some point in the 80s were treated with lead arsenate pesticides, and those pesticides stick around in soil. And there's a possibility that some of the apples may actually pull some of the arsenic out of the soil that may stick around residually.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. I'm going to try to move to some more policy-related questions. One for, I think, myself and maybe Keeve to respond to. It says, it appears that a lot of the issues we're talking about, whether treated lumber or poultry litter, et cetera, deal with agricultural input. EPA has set limits on sewage, sludge, and other inputs. Are there efforts at the federal level to set standards, presumably on arsenic, around agricultural inputs of concern? And I would just say no, I don't think there are any ongoing federal efforts to do that, although I guess the gist of some of my comments was that that might very well make sense given a multitude of different products and pathways by which these arsenic compounds seem to get into the food supply. And would either of you want to comment on that?
Sure. Well, I believe EPA actually banned the use of cacodyllic acid, which was an organic arsenical pesticide, just in 2009. So on the pesticide side of things, EPA has taken action in the past. But on the animal waste side of things, I have not seen any interest or initiative from the agency to actually act on that potential pathway of exposure.
And it's generally been one use or one contaminant problem at a time, not sort of a comprehensive effort to reduce exposure to arsenic generally through multiple pathways. At least that's my take on it.
That is consistent with my take too.
Yeah. And then finally, should I ask my Maryland senator to vote against the arsenic bill because it's no longer of value after the House amended their version of it?
I think that makes sense right now, yes.
Okay. Panelists, we're at the hour, and I wondered if you had any final comments that you'd like to make.
Keeve, do you...
Okay. I don't want me to put you on the spot.
Oh,
go ahead.
I'm happy to make one. I don't know if Brian already has one planned, but I guess I'll just go ahead. And that, I think one of the things that we've shown today is that there are a number of dietary and environmental pathways by which people are exposed to arsenic. And I think I'm really just echoing a point David made very clearly in that we need a sort of cumulative strategy across agencies and across federal mandates for minimizing human exposures to arsenic, given our rapidly evolving understanding of the importance of some of these chronic low-level exposures. So I'd hope in the future that federal agencies aim towards stronger collaborative efforts to actually do that.
And I guess I would just say there is a question here at the end saying, what's your recommendation for how to avoid high arsenic intake and still eat a healthy, regular diet? And I would just say, it's true that for any one food product, the levels are not necessarily huge, at least not for the average person. But what most of these analyses haven't taken into account is that we're all exposed to arsenic from different sources. And so for people, for example, that are already drinking water contaminated with arsenic up to 10 parts per billion, all these other exposure routes only add on top of that exposure to a known carcinogen. So my takeaway and what I tell patients is that for that reason, it does make sense if you know you can avoid some arsenic exposure through, for example, eating chicken raised without arsenic, and you're able to do so, it probably makes sense. Well, thank you, presenters, for your time today, and thank you all for joining us on the Healthy Food Action webinar series. Register on our website, healthyfoodaction.org, for the next April 25th webinar called Creating Just and Healthy Food Systems, the Role of Professional Associations. While there, you can also join our network and become part of a growing voice for healthier, more sustainable food systems. There's also links to current policy actions as well as recordings of past webinars. Today's recording will be available next week at that site. For those on social media, you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I want to thank again Dr. Jackson and Dr. Nachman for taking the time to present to us all, and thanks to all of you.